Well, thank you all. Please, come on. Our next panel, it's moderated by the former president of Dominican Republic and president of the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development, Leonel Fernández. And let me introduce our panelists, Jorge Castañeda, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico and professor at New York University. Eduardo Gamarra, professor at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. Please join us. Tulio Vera, interim president at Global Americans. And I cannot, oh, there you go. And Hugo Lopez, director for race and ethnicity research at the Pew Research Center. So welcome you all, ready to go.
Bueno, como veo que la mayoría de los que están aquí son de lengua española, salvo casos excepcionales, vamos a hacer un mix. Hablamos en español y en algún momento cambiamos al inglés. Una especie de Spanglish. Más o menos. Bueno, este tercer panel tiene una particular relevancia porque estamos hablando de temas de la actualidad. Dentro de 5 semanas, el próximo 5 de noviembre, habrá elecciones en este país para escoger el próximo presidente entre Kamala Harris y Donald Trump. Obviamente que eso tendrá un impacto en América Latina, eso tendrá una relevancia particular para el futuro de nuestros pueblos. Y no solamente América Latina, el mundo entero tiene sus ojos puestos en lo que va a ocurrir en Estados Unidos el próximo 5 de noviembre. Hasta ahora, lo que se ve es que, como decía esta mañana, Kamala Harris puede ganar el voto directo, el voto popular, como ocurrió en el 2016, cuando Hillary Clinton también obtuvo 3 millones de votos por encima de Donald Trump. Pero en Estados Unidos, las elecciones no se ganan en base al voto popular directo, sino a lo que llaman el Electoral College, los colegios electorales. Es una sumatoria de los senadores más los miembros de la Cámara de Representantes por cada estado. Conforme a lo que dicen las últimas encuestas, estas elecciones parece que se van a ganar o perder en 6 estados fundamentales, swing states, ¿verdad? O estados oscilantes, que serían Pensilvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia y Nevada, fundamentalmente. En todo esto también para nosotros resulta importante saber cómo se inclina el voto latino. ¿Cuál es el significado y el valor que tiene en estos momentos el voto de los latinos aquí en las próximas elecciones de Estados Unidos? Y eso, antes creíamos que el voto latino era fundamentalmente pro-demócrata. Hoy nos damos cuenta que no es tan así, es más diverso y dependiendo en qué estado. Bueno, entonces para discutir todos estos temas, las elecciones en sí, el voto latino, repercusiones en nuestros pueblos en América Latina, tenemos a unos distinguidos panelistas que nos acompañan. Está Jorge Castañeda a nuestra izquierda, a nuestra extrema izquierda, Jorge, sin que tenga otro significado ideológico, sino puramente topográfico. Está a la extrema derecha de ustedes, lo que significa que es ideológicamente neutro en el centro. Entonces, Jorge Castañeda, un viejo amigo, ex canciller de México, pero sobre todo un gran académico. Ha escrito cosas que han impactado la opinión pública en América Latina y el mundo académico en general. Tenemos al profesor Eduardo Gamarra, que ya para mí es un hermano. Tenemos más de 3 décadas de relaciones personales y hemos hecho tantas cosas en común. Él incluso fue nuestro principal asesor en el gobierno dominicano de la que fue nuestra política de seguridad democrática, además de también ser consultor en los procesos electorales. Así que buena parte de los éxitos que hemos tenido en realidad tienen el nombre de Eduardo Gamarra. Bueno, el profesor Tulio Vera, que es miembro de Global Americans y también un destacado economista que sigue muy de cerca los temas tanto de Estados Unidos como de América Latina. Gracias, don Tulio, por su presencia aquí. Y finalmente a Hugo Lopez, a quien yo tenía deseo de conocer personalmente, porque cuando entro en la página web del Pew Research Center leo sus trabajos, las encuestas que realiza, que siempre suelen ser muy edificantes con respecto a lo que ocurre con el mundo hispano. Él ha hecho un trabajo reciente sobre el voto latino, que prácticamente no es conocido porque es muy reciente, y él nos va a hablar hoy en el día de hoy sobre ese particular de cómo hoy día se percibe, cuál será el comportamiento electoral de los distintos grupos hispanos que pululan aquí en los Estados Unidos. Entonces, para comenzar este diálogo, vamos a empezar entonces con Jorge Castañeda, ¿no? ¿Cómo ve la situación? Que ha escrito un libro sobre los Estados Unidos. ¿Eh?
Gracias, presidente. Es un honor estar de nuevo con usted aquí en Nueva York. Agradezco la invitación, como siempre, de Funglode. Yo hablaría más bien de la repercusión de cualquiera de los dos resultados de la elección norteamericana en América Latina y en particular en México, pero sí quisiera disertar un segundo y más bien hacerle la pregunta a nuestro amigo de Pew sobre hasta qué punto las generalizaciones sobre el voto latino son válidas en el sentido de que creo tal vez, ¿no? Eso es lo que pregunto, no estoy seguro, pero se ha ido fraccionando cada vez más. Es decir, hay el voto cubano-americano en Florida, el voto puertorriqueño, no en Puerto Rico, desde luego, pero sí en Estados Unidos, que con un número importante de personas que salieron de la isla los últimos 10 o 15 años. El voto venezolano, en menor medida, pero también en Florida. Y desde luego el voto mexicano, que también hay el guatemalteco, salvadoreño, ecuatoriano, y el voto mexicano, norteamericano, que no estoy seguro que todos estos segmentos del voto latino actúen de la misma manera. Y no sé si en ocasiones, por ejemplo, las encuestas o los comentarios sobre las encuestas que indican que el voto latino esta vez va a ser menos demócrata que en otras ocasiones, si eso es cierto para el voto mexicano norteamericano, o más bien refleja quizás el peso de nuevos contingentes que han ido llegando los últimos 20 años a Estados Unidos de latinos, pero a diferencia de los mexicanos. Es una pregunta que me hago porque me cuesta trabajo, no digo que no sea así, el problema seguramente es mío y no de los votantes. Me cuesta trabajo ver cómo un mexicano norteamericano, después de todo lo que ha sucedido con el presidente Trump, pues pueda votar por él. Entiendo las razones por las cuales otros grupos latinos lo pueden hacer, pero me cuesta trabajo el caso de los mexicanos. Pero bueno, sobre el tema del impacto del resultado electoral en América Latina, yo creo que, presidente, si me permite, diría que por un lado es claro que la estridencia, el radicalismo, el extremismo en campaña de Donald Trump, pues sugiere que la verdad no puede haber mucha discusión sobre qué le conviene más a la gran mayoría de los países de América Latina en cuanto al resultado. Le conviene, en todo caso, menos a todos que Trump sea el próximo presidente de Estados Unidos. En primer lugar, porque ya lo vivimos y sabemos más o menos lo que significa, y en segundo lugar, porque una segunda administración de Trump pues tendría la falta de contrapesos, limitantes, restricciones que ya se han comentado mucho en Estados Unidos en estos meses de campaña. Y por otro lado, hay muchas razones para suponer que una victoria de la vicepresidenta Harris pues marcaría un buen grado de continuidad con las políticas del presidente Biden por muchas razones, pero entre otras porque como vicepresidenta Kamala Harris pues no ha mostrado un mayor interés ni compromiso con América Latina en un sentido u en otro, y por lo tanto pues probablemente seguiría más o menos las orientaciones actuales. Ahora, dicho eso, hay muchos aspectos o varios aspectos en los cuales la diferencia de fondo entre Trump y Harris sobre algunos de los temas más importantes para la mayoría de los países de América Latina, pues no son tan grandes. La estridencia es muy diferente. El fondo quizás lo sea menos. Tomaré rápidamente dos ejemplos nada más. El primero, evidentemente, es el migratorio. Como muchos de ustedes saben, ella ha endurecido mucho el tono en estas semanas a propósito de su postura frente al tema de la migración latinoamericana y no solo latinoamericana a Estados Unidos. Y ese endurecimiento de tono va junto con un endurecimiento de fondo de las políticas concretas del gobierno de Biden, del cual ella es parte, y que seguramente mantendría. Y ese endurecimiento de tono y de fondo, pues sí puede llevarnos a una situación donde lo que ya mucha gente ha comentado en el sentido de que entre las políticas reales de Trump durante 4 años y las políticas reales de Biden durante 4 años, en materia migratoria, pues no fueron tan distintas. La retórica fue distinta, el racismo, la xenofobia, etcétera, todo eso desde luego fue distinto. Pero, por ejemplo, la política de Remain in Mexico, quédate en México, que impulsó Trump primero, en los hechos ha sido la misma política de Biden. Y ahorita hay una enorme cantidad de venezolanos, cubanos, nicaragüenses, haitianos, ecuatorianos, etcétera, 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 en México, de alguna manera embotellados porque no pueden salir, pero ya llegaron y no quieren volver a sus países, y México desde luego no tiene los recursos, ni la voluntad, ni la capacidad de devolverlos a sus países. Puede mandarlos, y eso es lo que está haciendo el gobierno de México para vergüenza nuestra, es una verdadera vergüenza para cualquier mexicano esto. Lo que está haciendo el gobierno es mandarlos del norte al sur. Los trepan un avión o un autobús y los mandan de Reynosa a Villahermosa o a Tapachula, que son lugares, créanme, si no los conocen, no les conviene conocerlos. No vayan, no son lugares que quieran ustedes conocer. Nadie en su sano juicio quiere ir a Tapachula si no están obligados a ir a Tapachula. Crean, yo he ido muchas veces, no es un lugar que quieran visitar. Bueno, entonces, en esta materia empiezo a tener mis dudas sobre si hay una diferencia de fondo tan grande. Desde luego, la retórica de Trump es odiosa. Lo que hemos escuchado a propósito de los haitianos es algo absolutamente repugnante, y Kamala Harris ha sido muy cuidadosa en no incurrir en esos excesos verbales. Incluso a veces le sale una verdadera empatía para con los migrantes o los que solicitan asilo, y se nota que hay una comprensión y un cariño, sí lo hay, pero se está viendo obligada a asumir posiciones pues que no son en el fondo tan radicalmente distintas. Y tomo el otro caso para terminar. Ambos candidatos, desde luego más Trump y de manera más estridente Trump, son antichinos. Los dos están constantemente insistiendo en todas las cosas, todas las represalias, medidas, etcétera, que van a tomar contra China en materia comercial, de inversión, de propiedad intelectual, etcétera, etcétera. Independientemente de si tienen razón o no, es una discusión que luego mi amigo Jorge Jaime y yo tenemos muy seguido, pero en fin, independientemente de eso, más allá de la retórica, las posturas son bastante parecidas. Y esto va a colocar a muchos países, no a todos, pero a muchos países de América Latina, desde luego a México, pero no solo a México, en una situación muy complicada, muy incómoda, porque por un lado, pues es evidente que a nosotros en México, a los centroamericanos, los países del Caribe y a varias naciones del Cono Sur también, pues nos conviene la inversión china. Queremos inversión china. No en lugar de inversión norteamericana o japonesa o alemana, pero además de, y no solo inversión china en tierra como en la Argentina o en infraestructura como en Perú, etcétera, sino en manufacturas porque generan empleo permanente importante. Entonces, para nosotros es muy complicado que un candidato como Trump amenace con castigar a los países que aceptan, invitan, toleran, eh, convocan inversión china. Pero Kamala Harris no tiene posiciones muy distintas al respecto. Son bastante parecidas, insisto, sin la retórica, sin la estridencia, pero en el fondo con posturas en materia arancelaria, en materia de invocar asuntos de seguridad nacional, en materia incluso quizás de incluir, esto es para México nada más, algún elemento adicional antichino en la revisión del TEMEC, que ya tiene el TEMEC una cláusula de facto antichina, pues volver a meter algo más en el TEMEC que se va a revisar en el 2026. Gracias, presidente.
Muchas gracias, Jorge. Bueno, profesor Gamarra, quizás compartir con nosotros sus perspectivas de hacia dónde se dirige este proceso electoral, el impacto que va a tener socialmente
Sí.
hacia los países de la región.
Con mucho gusto, presidente. Y quiero simplemente hacer unas cuantas reflexiones en base a encuestas recientes que hemos venido desarrollando en FIU. Pero al presentarme así, estando sentado al lado de Mark, quien es básicamente la persona a la que todos vamos para entender un poco quiénes somos como hispanos, es un privilegio y verdaderamente creo que tenemos algunas visiones complementarias, ¿no? Estamos ahora en campo, en este momento, en los 7 estados bisagra y en California, Texas y la Florida. Vamos a revelar los resultados el 14 de octubre en Washington. De manera que no tengo data tan fresca, pero sí creo que es importante ver 3 o 4 cuestiones que son relevantes para esta conversación. Primero, un poco lo que mencionaba Jorge Castañeda, que es en realidad contestar esa pregunta: ¿quiénes somos? Tanto Pew como nosotros hace muchos años venimos preguntando esa cosa de cómo nos autoidentificamos, que ustedes todos saben que cuando llenamos los formularios, pues no sé, o nos encasillan, porque ahí está el tema de que racialmente cómo somos o si nuestro origen nacional es el válido. Y lo que hemos venido entendiendo es que la mayoría de nosotros nos consideramos hispanos. El 75% creemos que somos hispanos. Alrededor entre el 20 y el 23% nos consideramos latinos. Y la cosa de eso de Latinx, que es muy popular en universidades, pero que nadie sabe lo que es Latinx, ¿no? Incluyendo los hispanos a los que les preguntamos. Entonces, el tema de la autodefinición es muy importante, particularmente en el sentido que lo mencionabas tú, que es lo siguiente. Nosotros como hispanos y como bloque de votantes somos una complejidad muy, muy severa, porque somos de diferentes orígenes nacionales. Eso tiene una gran implicación a la hora del voto. Tiene también una gran implicación el momento de llegada, o sea, cuándo llegamos a Estados Unidos y en realidad bajo qué condiciones, ¿no? Y eso por supuesto, es un tema de enorme relevancia en este momento, particularmente cuando el candidato republicano o los candidatos republicanos dicen que estamos llegando para poder votar al día siguiente, ¿no? Cuando la mayoría sabemos que el proceso de nacionalización en este país Como promedio es 10 años, del momento de llegada hasta la nacionalización. Manera que los que están llegando ahora, si no son indocumentados, si no están en proceso de asilo, tendrán relevancia política, digamos, de acá a 20 años. Sus hijos quizás van a ser más relevantes políticamente hablando. O sea que yo creo que es importante entender eso. Segundo, el origen nacional, por supuesto que importa, y yo vivo en la Florida, donde el origen nacional es quizás más agudo por la presencia enorme de cubanos, ahora de venezolanos y también de colombianos. La Florida se divide demográficamente cubanos, puertorriqueños y mexicanos. Es la tercera fuerza en la Florida. Sin embargo, nadie habla de los mexicanos en la Florida y electoralmente van a ser cada vez más importantes en la Florida. Ahora, ¿por qué menciono a esos grupos? Porque de alguna manera están en contraposición generalmente. Los puertorriqueños históricamente han sido demócratas, salvo elecciones cuando no hay una participación electoral muy grande. Por ejemplo, el año 2022, los puertorriqueños en la Florida, el 46% votó por DeSantis. El 46%, una votación altísima. Suponemos ahora que si hay un gran turnout, ¿no? Eso se revertirá y la posibilidad entonces de que el voto puertorriqueño, que es casi del mismo tamaño que el voto cubano, logre cancelar la influencia del voto cubano. Esa es una esperanza demócrata, ¿no? Bueno, pero también hay el fenómeno de mexicanos en el Valle de Texas, ¿no? Que se han convertido en una fuerza republicana, pequeña, pero importante, ¿no? Ahora, la pregunta en realidad es, ¿los hispanos se están convirtiendo en republicanos? Que la prensa lo ha dicho pues a diestra y siniestra, y yo le comentábamos con Mark hace unas horas, tenga mucho cuidado con las encuestas, particularmente las que están saliendo de diferentes métodos, medios de prensa, etcétera, porque las muestras son tan pequeñas de hispanos, ¿no? Una muestra del New York Times, por ejemplo, nacional, era de 123 personas, ¿no? Que imposible generalizar, peor generalizar sobre el resultado en Arizona o en Wisconsin. Entonces, hay que tener mucho cuidado con las generalizaciones que salen de esas encuestas en particular. Y por eso las encuestas de Pew son tan importantes, ¿no? Ahora bien, en ese sentido, en las encuestas nuestras, hicimos la pregunta en la última encuesta, en el último año usted usted se cambió de partido político, y el 14% nos dijo que sí. Y de ese 14%, el 30% nos dijo que se cambió de demócrata a republicano. Pero la mayoría del cambio de ese 14% se volvieron independientes. Yo creo que ahí es donde gira el resultado electoral. O sea, hay que pasarle mucha atención al tema del voto independiente y sobre todo del voto independiente hispano. Ahora bien, si uno considera, por ejemplo, en los estados bisagra, tomemos simplemente el caso de Michigan. Michigan tiene entre el 4 y 5% de su población es hispana, que se traduce más o menos en 250,000 votantes. De esos 250,000, asumamos que en un buen año electoral el 60% vaya a votar, ¿no? Ese es un big assumption, ¿no? Entonces estamos diciendo que van a haber entre 100 y 150,000 hispanos que votarán, ¿ok? El resultado en Michigan va a ser definido por menos de ese margen. Lo que hace entonces es que el voto hispano, aún en un estado como Michigan, donde los márgenes son tan importantes, el voto hispano puede ser absolutamente definitorio. Ahora, tomemos algunos issues que también son claves, porque gran parte de lo que hemos visto es esta idea que todo republicano con el que conversen, y ustedes seguramente hay algunos republicanos acá, ¿no? Nos van a decir que los hispanos somos republicanos, pero no nos hemos dado cuenta de ello todavía, como dicen que dijo Ronald Reagan. Y la idea es que nuestros valores son republicanos. Y entonces nosotros medimos, al igual que Mark, cuáles son esos valores tan importantes. Y cuando les preguntamos a los hispanos si en términos de valores se sienten más cerca a los republicanos o a los demócratas, pero por una gran cantidad, los hispanos pensamos que el Partido Demócrata refleja nuestros valores. Si bien eso ha estado cambiando un poquito, pero generalmente los demócratas se identifican en términos de valores mucho más. Pero eso me lleva entonces a la pregunta que también hiciste, que tiene que ver con lo siguiente. Por ejemplo, en temas del aborto, ¿no? La mayoría, y ahí es donde vemos un gender gap enorme entre mujeres en las encuestas recientes nuestras, no sé si en las tuyas, pero lo que hemos visto, por ejemplo, es que la mujer hispana considera el aborto como algo extraordinariamente importante. El hombre tiene una diferencia de casi 20 puntos con la visión sobre el tema del aborto, ¿no? O sea que las mujeres son mucho más liberales que los hombres en ese sentido. Pero ahora pasemos al tema de migración, y acá es donde es bien complicado, Jorge, porque no sé si ustedes saben, conocen a Hialeah, la ciudad que progresa en Miami, ¿no? Hialeah es 98% hispano, predominantemente cubano, ¿ok? En Hialeah fue el expresidente Trump en noviembre del año pasado, y volvió hace 3 meses, para anunciar su plan masivo de deportaciones de ilegales, como él los denomina, ¿no? Y no solo la deportación masiva, sino anunció la creación de centros de retención para eventualmente deportar, y él mencionaba en ese entonces hasta 20 millones. Ahora, sí, ¿cómo se llama? Vance dijo que somos 25 millones los indocumentados. Pero en todo caso, lo dijo ante una audiencia de cubanos, de venezolanos, de colombianos, la mayoría de los cuales en algún momento no pasaron por esa ilegalidad, entre comillas, la ilegalidad de haber llegado ya sea vía Mariel o vía cualquier proceso, inclusive el proceso de ajuste cubano. Es un proceso por medio del cual uno llega sin documentos, pero nos legalizan. ¿Qué es lo que ha pasado hoy, tanto con TPS como Parol, ¿no? Los haitianos de Springfield son legales, no son ilegales, ¿no? Pero ¿cómo es que podemos tener un candidato que reciba ese endoso masivo de gente que básicamente estuvo en esa misma condición? Y acá quizás la explicación de la escalera, de la famosa explicación de migración de la escalera, que cuando uno llega a un barco, ¿no? Por favor, el último que subió al barco, cuando se llena, suba a la escalera. Tenemos ese gran fenómeno y lo vemos en las encuestas. Aquellos que llegamos antes nos consideramos mucho mejor que los que están llegando ahora, y pensamos que el barco está lleno y tenemos que cerrar la compuerta, ¿no? Eso me parece clave. Bueno, concluyo con lo siguiente para no tomar mucho tiempo y escuchar a mis colegas. El tema de participación en noviembre va a ser absolutamente clave. Y ahí quiero señalar algunas diferencias, tomando en consideración estas diferentes manifestaciones de la hispanidad que tenemos. El votante más disciplinado en los Estados Unidos es el cubano. El cubano en algunos precintos de Miami-Dade ha tenido participación de cerca del 74%, ¿okay? Que inclusive sobrepasa la participación de sajones, de anglosajones. Eso es importante. La participación de los demás es bastante floja. La participación promedio no llega al 50%. Entonces, yo creo que hoy, si es que consideramos el resultado de noviembre y estamos preocupados por el resultado de noviembre, en gran medida va a depender de la tasa de participación de minorías, sobre todo de hispanos, pero también de afrodescendientes, ¿no? Los afrodescendientes, afroamericanos, estuvieron peculiarmente ausentes en la Florida, ahora en noviembre del 22. El resultado fue una barrida completa de los republicanos. Si eso se repite a nivel nacional, que no creo que va a ser así, pero aprovecho para instarles a ustedes que son ciudadanos que por favor voten.
Muchas gracias, profesor Gamarra. Bueno, escuchando al profesor Gamarra nos damos cuenta de la complejidad del voto latino, no es homogéneo, pero existía la percepción y aún todavía, de alguna manera persiste la percepción de que los hispanos o latinos votan por los demócratas y no por los republicanos, y tal vez viene de un proceso histórico. Los demócratas eran los representantes de los de abajo, de los sindicatos, ¿no? Del hombre ordinario, mientras que los republicanos siempre eran vistos como los representantes de los empresarios, de la gente de Wall Street, ¿no? De los poderosos. Parece que en el tiempo eso ha ido cambiando y por tanto el comportamiento electoral también ha ido ajustándose a esa realidad. Pero hay un aspecto también económico, ¿verdad? Atrae mucho cuando Trump dice que en su campaña electoral que de llegar al gobierno va a disminuir los impuestos. Tax cut, ¿no? Habla mucho. Y por supuesto, no importa que sean hispanos, afrodescendientes, lo que sean, la gente lo que menos quiere es que le golpeen el bolsillo. Entonces es posible que eso esté jugando un papel. El profesor Tulio Vera, que nos dice sobre este particular.
Muchas gracias. I'm going to speak in English because I'm an economist and most of my life I've worked in English and it makes it easier. So I'm trying to be convenient here. Couple of things. First, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to talk about not only the economic plans or platforms, better put, of the Trump and the Harris administration or potential administrations, and what they could mean for Latin America and what they could mean for the Latin American economies in particular. So let me start by saying neither candidate has really defined their policies or their platforms very well. Trump is a bit more advanced in terms of the policies, but not that much because he keeps acting on impulse and saying different things every time he gets up to the mic. And Harris, because of the nature of what happened, because she only came into the scene 2 or 3 months ago, hasn't really had the chance yet to fully define a program, an economic program. That said, we know enough from speeches, from their websites, to kind of paint a picture of what they stand for. Second thing I want to say from the get-go is I'm going to talk about economics. I'm going to try not to make political judgments because that's not my strength. And so I'll try to stick with the economics and what's purely technical. The third thing I'm going to do is, like any, I'm a Wall Street economist by training, so maybe part of the evil crowd here, but economists, and I'm a research guy, economists on Wall Street tend to start with their conclusions. So I'm going to start with the conclusions, which are basically the international aspect of both economic platforms is the part that is more prejudicial and negative for Latin America than the domestic policy. And I'll explain why that is. On the international front, we'll start with the concept of tariffs. Tariffs are a big deal these days. Unfortunately, I would have to characterize both candidates as protectionist. The scope for a free trade agreement, which maybe 5 years ago, there was still some sort of aspirational expectation to have trade agreements, is gone. It's gone in Washington, it's gone pretty much everywhere. Everybody competes on how high a tariff you can impose. In the case of Trump, it is particularly protectionist. He, depending on which day or what side of the bed he got out of, one day he will say, today we're going to have 10% tariff across the board on all imports. The next day he'll say 20%. He said he's on record saying, I'm going to put 60% tariffs on all Chinese imports. And he said he can go as high as 200% on Mexican autos. Okay, so they're all over the place. But the bottom line is that this is a protectionist universe. Harris, on the other hand, has not been so vocal on the question of tariffs, but as you may remember, Biden never took off or never reduced the increased tariffs that Trump put in his first term. And most of what comes out of the Harris campaign these days is, you can say, not a version of what Bidenomics is, not deviating too far. So I have to suspect that tariffs are part of her arsenal. Is this bad for Latin America? Yes, it's bad. Obviously, it's bad. It means less exports to the U.S. Maybe it means that there, in some areas, although I don't think this has been studied enough, in some areas, Latin American exports can compete or can take over what the Chinese cease to export because of the increased tariffs that Trump is planning to put on China. But that's another story. What we do know is, for the U.S., for the average guy, why is Trump doing this? He's doing it because he wants to correct the trade deficit. The U.S. is running an important trade deficit these days. Putting tariffs on is a brutal way of correcting the trade deficit, but it also has implications for the average guy. It's going to be a sales tax, as Harris said in the debate. It's going to be a sales tax that hits every American consumer, and that's inflationary. We've spent 2 or 3 years battling inflation in this country. It seems like we're finally getting the upper hand on inflation. The Fed started cutting rates a few weeks ago, but this is going to reverse that to a certain extent, and it will lead probably to another round of Fed hikes if it gets really bad. Another thing here, which is, I think, very important, and again, not very well documented, but I think more and more people are going to start doing this if Trump gets elected, is the impact on the existing trade agreements. So we have the USMCA, which is going to be revisited, put it that way, in 2026. And you have a number of free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements between the US and Chile and Colombia and Peru. If the tariffs are sufficiently onerous, the tariffs that a Trump administration would implant, some of these FTAs we may be violating some of the covenants and some of the aspects of the FTAs, and it could lead to retaliation on the part of the Latin American countries. So this is going to be a big deal if it really comes to fruition, and I think it's one of the negative aspects. Let me move to and which sectors? Most likely, agriculture would be impacted. Autos, Mexican autos in particular, textiles. Those are all sectors that would be affected by an increase or a widespread across the board tariff increase on Latin American products. The second part of the international side of the equation is immigration policies. Harris has already indicated she's going to be less tolerant of immigration, more concerned about border issues than the Biden administration was. But the real issue, again, for better or for worse, comes with Trump and the whole aspect of deportation. So some numbers were mentioned before. People talk between 1 million to 10, maybe 12 million illegal immigrants or higher that could potentially be deported. I'm not going to sit here and try to figure out how logistically, legally, how you do this, because it's a massive undertaking. We would need the National Guard, we would need the military, we would need camps to put people in transition. It will be a sorry for the French shit show, and it could get very, very complicated. That's not even to mention the implications for Latin America. Imagine the situation in Central America, in Mexico, and some of the countries that would have to receive, Dominican Republic, that would receive the deported migrants, and how they would deal with that economically in terms of the disruptions that would create. That would be a very, very significant thing. And another aspect, which I think is very important, people tend to forget, is the question of remittances. A lot of immigrants, documented or not, in this country send back money to their countries of origin. Just to give you some numbers, in the case of Mexico, 4% of GDP is in terms of is remittances, or the remittances amount to 4% of GDP. In the case of the Dominican Republic, it's about 9%. In the case of Honduras, it's about 28%. That's a huge number. So if you cut that in half, it has serious implications for the local economy. So that's on immigration policy. And the third, sort of on the international side, is the currency thing, or the dollar. Trump is on record as saying he wants a weaker dollar. This is unusual. I don't want to say the strong dollar has been the cornerstone of U.S. policy, but for the last few decades, a strong dollar has been an important aspect of U.S. Economic policy. A weak dollar, I don't know how you would engineer a weak dollar, but the thing that Trump has hinted at is intervention in the Federal Reserve, or erosion, put it this way, erosion of the independence of the Federal Reserve. You'd basically be introducing politics into monetary policy, which is a no-no for any kind of modern central bank. He may want to, he's on record as having said he would like to be one of the votes on the open market committee, so that when there's an interest rate decision, he's said many things which technically and in terms of good economics are just bad things. So a weak dollar, if it does get engineered, and I very much doubt that he would have the political wherewithal, depending on the makeup of Congress, obviously, but that he would have the wherewithal to do something to reduce the independence or erode the independence of the central bank, of the Federal Reserve. But a weak dollar is typically correlated with low commodity prices. Historically, you look at the correlation and they're very highly correlated. Strong dollar times usually mean strong commodity prices. For Latin America, for better or for worse, we've talked about this before, commodities are still, the bread and butter. And so to the extent that Trump is able to get a weaker dollar, which again, I'm skeptical, that would have negative implications for commodity prices. So those on the tariff side, on the immigration side, and on the dollar side, those are kind of the three features of policy platforms of the candidates. And all three of those, Trump's policies are not very auspicious, put it that way. Then there's a side of domestic policy, and I'll run through those quickly because those are less impactful. Fiscal policy, both candidates are fiscally relaxed or fiscally loose, put it that way. And that is a bad thing, given, if I give you some numbers, the fiscal deficit of the US, depending on whether you measure it as the central government or the general government, which is the broader definition, today, or 2024, estimates by the IMF that our fiscal deficit is somewhere between 6.8 and 7.8% of GDP. That's very high by any standard, okay? Debt to GDP, which is a measure that economists tend to use, the IMF for 2024 estimates the central government 100% of GDP, so debt to GDP ratio of 100%, and for the general government, the broader version, 125% of GDP. Those are, you may remember, if you remember your economic history of 10, 12 years ago, the European crisis, it was all about Greece reaching these kinds of debt levels, and some of the southern European countries like Italy and Spain reaching these kinds of debt to GDP levels. So that's a question. And both candidates, as I said, lean towards looser fiscal policies. Trump much more so, because he promises tax cuts of one shape or another, of one color of another every day. Harris is not so much on record as being highly loose on fiscal policy, but she's got a lot of expenditures in the pipeline that she wants to implement. The big thing on fiscal policy in the US is the expiration in 2025 off the 2017 tax cuts that Trump passed. Trump is on record as saying, I'm going to continue those tax cuts. They're going to remain. Harris has said that she will eliminate them for folks that make more than $400,000 a year. So in other words, for the wealthy, she will eliminate those tax cuts. But in any event, neither of them are very good for fiscal policy. That does not have huge implications for Latin America, but it is a drag on growth because eventually the Federal Reserve would have to counteract any kind of severe fiscal looseness. And that is always historically bad for Latin America when the Fed starts raising interest rates again. Just two other points real quickly. Price controls, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but Harris has talked about putting price controls on price gougers, especially insofar as food and things like that. She's kind of backtracked a little bit on that recent weeks. That's just bad economics. Hopefully it won't go very far. I don't think it will have much of an impact at all for Latin America, but it's one aspect of her policy that it's just not a good thing. And thirdly, industrial policy. Both candidates favor industrial policy of one sort or another. I'm not going to go into industrial policy because it's too detailed, but I'll just mention a couple of things very quickly. One, Trump's, if you stick with the climate aspect of things, Trump is more favorable to carbon fossil fuels. That's what I meant. So that would probably benefit a country like Venezuela or Colombia. Mexico is a different story these days in terms of oil. And then in the case of Harris, it's more of a renewable energy, and that would favor countries like Chile or Argentina, where lithium and new kinds of energies are being sourced and are booming. I'll stop there because I've said a lot, and just want to thank you again.
Thank you, Tulio, for your great presentation. And now we turn over to Mark Hugo Lopez.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel more comfortable in English, you can make your presentation in English.
Spanglish okay?
Spanglish okay.
Okay, all right. Thank you, President Fernández, for the opportunity to be here today. It's great to get to talk to all of you. I had a PowerPoint presentation I was going to show, but kind of feel weird about it being behind people. So if you want a copy of my presentation, I'm happy to share it with folks afterwards. I want to share with you some results from some of our surveys and our demographic analysis. And I'm going to try to go quick because it's a lot of numbers. And so feel free to ask me questions afterwards if you would like to drill down on a particular number. But let's start with first the importance of Latino voters. And by the way, you're going to notice I'm going to say Latino voters as opposed to the Latino vote. That's on purpose because this is a diverse population, not community, population that has different points of views depending on who you're talking to, the part of the country you live in, and the experiences of those populations in different parts of this nation. So first off, how many Latinos are at least 18 years of age and a U.S. citizen? That means that would make them eligible to vote. Today, that number is at over 36 million people, meaning that Latino voters could potentially account for 15% of U.S. voters this election cycle. That number, to give you some context, is up by 4 million people since 2020. 4 million just alone since 2020. Why? Because it's many young US-born Latinos who come of age and are now eligible to vote. They're now over 18 and they were born here, so they're US citizens. They make up 3/4 of that increase. But the other quarter comes from people largely who are naturalizing or moving from Puerto Rico to the United States, who are then eligible to participate in US elections. But it's a dynamic change. I'm not sure if you grasp what I'm trying to say, which is this is a fast growing population. It's now eclipsed the Black population as a potential voter group. And that really, really is quite striking. It's second only to white Americans in terms of size. All that said, while Latinos are dispersed around the country and in the general population make up 20% of all Americans, so get that also, 1 in 5 Americans today are Latinos, which is a really fascinating number. But that dispersion of the population across the states and across metropolitan areas means that Latinos are more important than ever for this election cycle because they're in the battleground states that matter. In Arizona, Nevada, they're more than 20% of voters. In a state like Georgia, North Carolina, they're about 5 to 6% of voters. In Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they're about 5 to 6% of voters. Doesn't sound like a lot, but in a close election, that could make the difference. All right, so that's sort of the landscape. Let's talk a little bit about public opinion polling and what we're finding. So if the election were held today, who would Latino voters support? Our most recent survey from September found that among Latino registered voters, 57% would vote for Kamala Harris, 39% for Donald Trump. What's interesting here is to compare that to 2020. And let's talk about what happened in 2020. Joe Biden won 61% of Latino voters' support. Donald Trump, 36%, according to our validated voter study. There are many other estimates out there, but they're all about in that same range. It looks like Donald Trump hasn't lost ground. And in fact, if you look at Donald Trump's performance compared to 2016, because he was on the ballot back then too against Hillary Clinton, he won 28% of Latino voters' support nationally. She, 67%. So if you see the pattern, you see an increase, at least, or at least a stabilization of support for Trump since at least 2020. So it may be that this is a more enduring shift among some Latinos towards the Republican Party in recent years, and Democrats have lost some ground, though they're still winning, more than likely to win the majority of Latino voter support. So that's number one, sort of where the horse race is. Number two, top issue. When you ask Latinos, what's the most important issue to your vote this year for president? Economy is number one. 75% say the economy is a top issue. Following the economy, healthcare, and then violent crime. And we asked about 10 issues. Immigration was in the middle of the pack. 51% identified immigration as important to determining their vote. But the profile of issues differs depending on which set of Latino voters we're talking to. If you're talking to Latino voters who are going to vote for Harris, 80% say the economy is a top issue, followed by healthcare and gun policy. For Latinos who say they're going to vote for Trump, 93% say the economy is a top issue. So they're more likely to identify it as a top issue, followed by 72% say violent crime and 71% say immigration. So immigration is the number 3 issue for Latinos who say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. It is actually number 9 of 10 issues among Latinos who say they're going to vote for Harris. So we oftentimes talk about the way to reach Latinos is through immigration, talking about immigration policy. Maybe for some, maybe not for others, but I think it's important to note there is a distinct different profile of issues for the candidate, for Latino voters based on their support for different candidates. Number 3, how do Latinos see the candidates on the issues? Who has the advantage? So when you ask Latino registered voters, say on the issue of immigration, do you think Kamala Harris will make good decisions? Donald Trump make good decisions? And you ask about all those 10 issues we asked about: healthcare, violent crime, gun policy, etc. On 9 of the 10, oh, sorry. I get excited. I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry about that. So on 9 of the 10 issues that we asked about, we found that Kamala Harris has a 2-digit advantage, at least a 10-point plus advantage over Donald Trump. So Latinos say Harris would be better on immigration, be better on healthcare, be better on abortion, would be better on Supreme Court appointments. So generally speaking, she's seen as the better candidate on all of these, except one where they're tied, the economy. So on the economy, Latinos are equally likely to rate them both at about half say they would make good decisions on economic policy. Number 4, and this in this survey, want to see if I'm okay. I think so. On number 4, we wanted to ask about temperament and characteristics. We asked her, do you think the candidate's even tempered? What about down to earth? What about standing up for the things they believe in? And we asked about 10 different characteristics. Throughout all of this, Kamala Harris has a wide advantage, except on one, which is standing up for what they believe in. So Latino voters, irrespective of who they're voting for, they're more likely to say that Harris is even-tempered than Donald Trump, is down to earth compared to Donald Trump, it can get along with people like you more so than Donald Trump. But when it comes to standing up for the things they believe in, here you'll find that the Latino voters rate them about the same. The final point that I want to make, number 5, is I want to get back to the importance of the economy, because the economy is really important here for Latinos. Since 2022, we've been asking about inflation of food and cost of things. And we've been asking about the cost of housing. We've asked about unemployment, and we've also asked about the stock market. Latinos today, more than in 2022, say they're worried about rising prices on food and cost of living goods, and they're worried about housing costs, rising housing costs. 70% or more say that they're very concerned or somewhat concerned about those trends. They're also concerned about unemployment, but a little bit less so, but a majority are. But it only shows you how much Latinos are concerned about economic conditions. Negative economic conditions are shaping a lot, I think, about how they are thinking about this election. And I'm sorry, I had one more point. So my last point, point number 6, is about turnout. And Eduardo, as you were saying before, this has been one of the challenges for Latinos. You heard me talk about the relative youth of Latino voters. About a third of Latino eligible voters are under the age of 30. So they're 18 to 29. That means they're probably voting for the first time, many of them. They need to figure out where to register. They're also starting their lives, jobs, perhaps starting a family. It may not be top of mind. That will always be a challenge because it's not something that's new. It's been going on for about, well, I guess for 2 decades, maybe 2.5 decades now. So youth will continue to present many first-time voters within the Latino voter pool. The other important part here is that even beyond that, Latinos are more likely to be overrepresented among people who do not vote and underrepresented among people who do vote. So in 2016 and in 2020, 10% of voters were Latino, both cycles. Those were high turnout elections, and Latinos turned out in record numbers, but it was still just 10% of voters. They're underrepresented. What about non-voters? They were 20% of non-voters in both elections. So they're overrepresented among people who don't vote. It's a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about that. But I wanted to say thank you for listening. Again, I had a PowerPoint slide deck that I'm happy to share. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, before we turn over to the audience for questions, I would just like to make a quick comment. Listening to you, you said 15% of the voters are Latinos. That makes up for 36 million voters.
So 15%,
15%, 36 million, added up 4 million from 2020 to 2024. So that's a lot. When you said that, I remembered a book written by Professor Samuel Huntington some years ago, saying that the Hispanics represent the largest challenge for the future of the U.S. And then he kind of made a joke saying the U.S. national anthem begins by saying, always say, can you see? It's going to be Jose, can you see? So let's turn over to questions now from the audience. Gustav.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know that I'm taking advantage of my role as a moderator and being part of the fun of the event, but you both, Mark and Eduardo, tackle one of the topics that it excites me when we talk about politics in the U.S. my question is related to when we talk about voto Latino, we always talk about nationalities when we want to distinguish this voto Latino, right? It's not the same when we talk about the Dominican living in New York or a Mexican living in Texas. Okay, got it. What happened with the second generation? What happened with the young people that grow up here in the US, study here, they feel more Americans than Guatemalans, Mexicans, or whatever, and they have to go to the polls. What influenced they the most? Where they live or what they hear at home?
That's a really good question, Gustavo. You remind me that I didn't get a chance to talk about demographic differences among Latino voters. And in fact, one of the interesting patterns you see is that many US-born Latinos who grow up here, Latinos who grow up here, born here, grow up here, and become eligible to vote, they generally look more Democrat-leaning, so they're more likely to say they're going to support Kamala Harris. But there's some other things happening with that group. For example, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but the share of the US Latino adult population that identifies as Catholic is in sharp decline. 2010, 67% of Latino adults said they were Catholic. Today, it's 43%. But what's gone up? It hasn't been evangelical Christians. That's about the same. It stayed stable, and they lean very heavily Republican. But it is unaffiliated Latinos, largely young Latinos who grew up here, who are reflecting what you see generally for young Americans, which is that they may grow up in a religion. So they might grow up Catholic, but they become adults and they're no longer practicing and they don't identify as such. So in many ways, that second generation, I would add the third generation, people born here in the US to parents who are also born here, they are looking more and more like other young Americans who lean Democrat, who lean towards Kamala Harris in this election. That's generally what we're seeing. But there are some other trends, some other patterns. To give you another example, one of the other stories is Jorge was talking about Mexican Americans in the Southwest. You look at third generation Mexican American men, particularly in the southwestern part of the US, and they have leaned more Trump in recent elections or Republican. So there are those patterns as well. They may have a non-Hispanic spouse. They may even be the children of one parent who is a Hispanic parent and the other one who is not. So there's a lot of mixing happening as well, which may be affecting the viewpoints of later generations of Latinos. But it only goes to show you, as you probably heard many people say, Latinos are not a monolith. They are diverse. And there is so many different aspects to this. We could talk all day about this. I think origins are important, but I want to stress that because there's so much dispersion around the country, particularly of Mexican Americans, I don't think there's any one Mexican American story. I think there's multiple Mexican American stories depending on the state. About 75% of the nation's Cuban population is in Florida. So that's kind of a unique story, but no other origin group is as concentrated in one place as Cuban Americans. That to me says the local conditions are going to shape a lot about what people think and view in those places. So somebody in North Carolina could be different from somebody in Colorado.
Let me just add to that. Just a very small observation related to, when you listen to some of the immigration theorists, right, and based on the experience of other groups of immigrants in the United States, you kind of always have this discussion, right, that parents tend to be more hardworking, they tend to be more conservative, et cetera, and then their children become, like the rest of us, right? And but you have some really interesting things. For example, in Florida, we hypothesized for a long time that the second and third generations of Cuban Americans would move away from the Republican Party and would become Democrats. Well, we saw that occur during the Obama administration, right? We saw a very significant move over toward the Democratic Party. And so, we had, for example, one very important question in our Cuba poll. We do a Cuba poll every 2 years. We asked the question about the embargo, right? Do you support the lifting of the embargo? And we had from 1993 until 2016, the majority of Cubans, of course, were absolutely opposed to the lifting of the embargo. But in 2016, it dropped down well under 50%. And it kind of reflected what was going on nationally and that shift over to Barack Obama. When we ask the same question now, upwards of 70% are against the lifting of the embargo. So these kinds of things also change. And then one more thing. When we ask, especially these populations, Cubans, Colombians, and Venezuelans, and we've been able to drill down among those groups, we've asked, in your decision to vote, how much does what Washington says about your home country, right, or your parents' home country, influences your decision? 70% say yes. And when you ask them, what about the candidate and the candidate's position, right? Then as well with regards to the home country. So I think you have to look at specific groups. I think the difference with Mexicans is very, very big, but especially with these groups that still live, eat, and breathe. Miami is still the closest city to the United States, right? So people there are still constantly, thinking about Latin America, and their parents and their grandparents still reinforce that. Okay.
We got three final questions, Professor Hain.
A question for Martin for Eduardo on what we might call the Puerto Rican paradox. Puerto Ricans have traditionally been known to vote more for Democrats than for Republicans. And what happened with the most recent outward migration from the island, many of them moved to Florida, many to Orlando. The expectation was that they might even, flip the state, as it were, for two reasons, both because of their tradition and also because President Trump was particularly nasty towards Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. You may remember Hurricane Maria. He went there and threw a hand towel at, it was a bad scene. Yet, what I hear is that didn't necessarily happen. That in fact, many Puerto Ricans arrived in Florida and started to vote Republican. And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that.
So I'll offer a possible explanation. I don't have enough hard evidence on this, but on the island, the religious profile of adults on the island is more evangelical, more charismatic Catholic than it is on the mainland. And so the people who moved to Central Florida may have been more conservative on issues like abortion than other Puerto Rican voters in other parts of the US. Now, the reason why I say I don't have hard evidence on this is I don't have a survey to be able to say, this is it. What I do have is conversations with reporters who went to Orlando in 2020, in 2016 as well, and were surprised at how many Puerto Ricans, one, were supporting Trump, but were also surprised at the presence of religion and conversation about abortion at those events as well. That's not representative of everything, but it's a possible explanation. But I think Eduardo might know more.
Okay. Well, we have surveyed Puerto Ricans in Florida, and what we found is something quite interesting, right? And this is a general observation about the Democratic Party's behavior in Florida. There's no Democratic Party in Florida, right? And in some measure, this is accelerated as a result of the 2020 results, where Democrats realized that Florida is no longer a swing state. So why are we going to invest a heck of a lot of time in Florida? And the Puerto Rican vote is one of the votes that they had to invest in. The other thing is that Democrats, in not paying attention to them, they suffered because we had a governor, a guy named Scott, who's now running for re-election, a multimillionaire or maybe billionaire, who dedicated himself largely to, he traveled 12 times to Puerto Rico during the hurricane. He set up welcome committees at the airports for Puerto Ricans, right? In the meantime, his contender, Senator Nelson, who now heads NASA, right, when I presented the survey, Senator Nelson's response, the Republicans had their representative and were able to talk about how much of an effort they had put into the Puerto Rican community. Senator Nelson said that in 1973 or 72, when he was flying, when he was orbiting the Earth, he could see Puerto Rico and it was such a beautiful island. Okay, that gives you a sense of how much attention Democrats were paying to different populations. It has changed. And I think it largely depends on voter turnout. As I said, in 2022, 46% voted for DeSantis. I don't think that's going to happen now. And by the way, I wonder if it's going to happen in Georgia. You saw that the President Trump went and started throwing sandwiches. I don't know what it was he was throwing at the damnificados from this.
Thank you. My question is for Eduardo, and perhaps Mark, you could weigh in. I remember having a conversation with you a few years ago, and you mentioned to me how it was curious to see the dichotomy of Colombian American voters and how in the Obama election, they voted overwhelmingly for him, but they're Uribistas at heart. And I wanted to ask you how both of you have seen the evolution of the Colombian American vote in South Miami.
Our data for Colombians is a little dated. It goes back to December of last year. All right. And in that survey, we were precisely trying to measure that. We were trying to see which group had moved further to the right in the context of Florida. And our hypothesis was, of course, that it was going to be the Venezuelans. What we discovered, in fact, is that it is the Colombians that have moved the closest to the right. And a lot of it has to do with something that's occurring, which is really, really interesting in American politics in general. And that is that these immigrant communities, right, have very strong ties back home, which is not the case of earlier migrants, right? And President Fernández knows this very well with the Dominican community, right? You're still, thinking about the Dominican Republic. And so what goes on at home is really important. With the Colombians, what seems to have really affected them, it began with the peace process. And at that time, you remember the referendum and the vote, that had an enormous impact on how Colombians thought in Miami. And then the second thing was the election of Petro. That is probably the most recent event. And we're currently also in the field with a Colombian survey. But we're already beginning to see in focus groups, right, how the absolute rejection of Petro is really very significant in how they vote domestically. So,
because of time constraint, we only have the possibility for one last question. Over here, please. Yes.
Buenas tardes. Por casualidad, ustedes tienen la información de cómo está inclinado el voto de la mujer latina a nivel nacional.
It's a really great question. My apologies for English, but it's a really great question. Voter turnout for Hispanic women, for Latinos, has generally outpaced Hispanic men. In this most recent poll that we have, among Hispanic men, 41% say they're supporting Trump. Among women, 37%. So there is a gap, but I would say that if you look at Latinas, they too have shifted towards Trump since 2016. So this is not just about men, but maybe men have done so more. Latinas are just like other reflecting patterns of other women nationally. Voter turnout rates for women often exceed men. And that's no different for Black women oftentimes have the highest voter turnout rates.
Well, I think we have learned a lot with these great presentations for our panelists, and I think they deserve a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you. Gustavo, el final panel. Gracias a ustedes. Bien.